Is anybody else expected, Prashant, or should we just start off?
No, sir, we'll wait. Rakesh will log in.
Okay. Prashant, I think we should start off because otherwise we won't have time.
Yes, sir.
Yeah. So let's start. Okay, Rakesh has come. Good. So let's start off and try and finish as much as we can of Plato today. Okay, just let me start where I had left off in the previous class. In the previous class, I had talked to you about the influence of Socrates on Plato. And before that, you see on the slide, there is a question, is Socrates a real philosopher? Okay, which means there are some conjectures made by people, sorry, that Socrates is not really a philosophical figure. There was a character called Socrates who was alive because he was given hemlock poison and made to drink that and die. But a lot of people at one time used to argue that Socrates is just perhaps a character who's being used by Plato as his mouthpiece. That is the uh, argument that we used to find. But subsequent research has shown that the debates between sophists and Socrates uh, are not fictional, and those debates were indeed real debates. And so Socrates was definitely an influence as a teacher as far as uh, Plato is concerned. Okay, so one influence on Plato uh, to write uh, the books that he did was definitely Socrates. The other significant influence is the uh, speech made by Pericles, Pericles. This particular speech is called uh, the, the Periclean oration. Oratory is speaking. And this oration of Pericles came after the defeat of Athens to Sparta in the Peloponnesian War. It is called the Peloponnesian War because the territory on which the war was fought was Peloponnese. That is where they fought the war, and therefore it was called the Peloponnesian War. And in this particular oration, what we find is that Pericles tried to find out why is it that Athens lost to Sparta, and his conclusion was that Athens had two problems. One is that it had a population of citizens who were not physically fit and not good enough to fight a war. They had to rely on slaves. And the other thing that a conclusion that he came to is that, Athens uh, lost the war because of not very good system of governance. Okay, so that is the background for the Republic. This is the most important work of Plato. The Statesman is also, the Republic is a proper book. The Statesman is some kind of an essay, as is the Laws. Okay, and there is also another book which is called the Dialogues. I put it off Plato. Dialogue, please don't put it here as filmy dialogues, not those kind of dialogues, where dialogue is a conversation between two people. Okay, and it's a documentation of the arguments that Socrates had with other sophists, particularly Protagoras, Protagoras, Protagoras and Anaxagoras, Anaxagoras. The dialogues that he had with Protagoras and Anaxagoras, that is what we find. A part of these is also to be found in the Republic, because the Republic also uses these dialogues, and in order to establish a point about how a good polis, POLIS, should come into being. And as students of political science, we don't really need to talk about the statesman and the laws. We only need to talk about the Republic, which is the work of consequence. Okay, so we will be discussing what Plato said in the Republic. Now, before we start off with what was there in the Republic, first let's try to understand what is Plato's epistemology. Okay, epistemology should be understood as the pursuit of knowledge. Okay, I did talk to you while we were doing introduction to the Western philosophy political philosophy, that there are two ways in which people have investigated uh, philosophically. One is an epistemological investigation. The word comes from episteme, Episteme. Episteme, some people translate it as knowledge, but that's not a very good translation. It should be framework. Okay, an episteme is a framework into which you fit your knowledge. And the other kind of thing that people talk about, which came in with in the late 19th century and the early 20th century, in the form of phenomenology and in the form of uh, existentialism, both of the German and the French variety. This is called ontology, Ontology. Ontology is the pursuit of being. So if you are somebody who believes in ontology, you will argue that why should I have knowledge? You'll begin there. And if you're an epistemologist, your answer will be because you need to have knowledge. It's as simple as that. Knowledge is required. But if you look at ontology in the other sense of the term, then the ontologist will tell you that I need to have knowledge in order to make sense of my own existence. That is why it's called the pursuit of being. Being written with a capital B, which means the state of affairs in which we are. Okay, that is ontology. Now, Plato doesn't have a strong ontological component to his philosophy. His epistemological component is pretty strong. Uh, and Plato is somebody who believed in the idea that we are born with knowledge. Okay, this is the idea that Plato has, as opposed to the modern kind of thinking where we think that we are born with an empty mind and that we understand the world as we come into contact with it. That is what we think in the modern period. And this has to be attributed mainly to John Locke and his essay concerning human understanding, in which he says that we are born with an empty mind, a tabula rasa. But Plato doesn't agree with that kind of a thing. Plato says that we are already born with knowledge in our brains. Okay, that is where you see the third influence on Plato, which is something that comes from Pythagoras. Okay, not Pythagoras. It is supposed to be pronounced Pythagoras. All right, and what Plato says is that the ideal is the real, right? That is the beginning of Plato's philosophical investigations into things, that the ideal is the real, right? Now, this is something that we find a little difficult to understand. We find this a little difficult to understand because we are brought up on the Second World War idea of the real, and also the interwar period, which is the interregnum between the First World War and the Second World War, where you had people like Reinhold Niebuhr and E.H. Carr, who talked about realism as the opposite of idealism. Bertrand Russell was an idealist. Okay, he believed that we should have peace in the world. Okay, he believed that there should be no wars. So that is considered to be the ideal, and the real is the opposite of it. And the post Second World War scenario with Hans Morgenthau's intervention uh, about politics among nations and talking about national interest as being the driver of the policy of any country, whether it is domestic policy or whether it is foreign policy. He says it is the national interest of a country that drives it. And that for him is real. And he says that there is going to be some kind of conflict because different countries having national interests of their own are not likely to live together in peace. He believes that they will live in tension. And that is also the beginning of the Cold War between the USSR, which emerged as a superpower after the Second World War, and the United States of America, which was the other superpower. Okay, so you had the world divided. I'm sure you've done all this in your international relations. So realism is where you had the NATO versus the Warsaw Pact countries trying to defend their ideologies. The ideology of the USA, though they called it democracy, strictly speaking, it is capitalism. And if you look at the ideology of the USSR, Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, the ideology that it followed was communism. Okay, and if you read Marx very carefully, and I'll talk about this if I'm still your teacher when we do Marx, Marx actually believed that uh, real democracy was something that could not be achieved uh, in the framework of capitalism. He believed that communism was actually was the best form of society and governance, which would encourage proper democracy, which is the governance of the people by themselves. Okay, so when we talk about, when I normally ask people, what is the definition of democracy? They give me this horrible thing definition, which says of the people, for the people, by the people. And I say, what of the people, what for the people, what by the people? That is something that people don't tell you. It is the rule of the people, for the people, by the people. And this particular definition should be attributed to Abraham Lincoln, who talked about democracy after the conclusion of the Civil War in around 1865, and that was the time when uh, the Confederates were defeated by the Unionists in America. And he made this very famous speech in a small, quaint little place called Gettysburg, Gettysburg, Gettysburg. And in Gettysburg, he made the speech where he said democracy is the rule of the people, for the people, by the people, which is not necessarily a great definition, especially considering the fact that America does not practice democracy. America, I told you, only 538 people vote for the president. Okay. And then you're supposed to have this election for the electoral college. And Hillary Clinton, last time, that is the popular vote, she had about 3 or 4 million votes more than Donald Trump. Okay. And despite that, Donald Trump became the president because of the fact that the Electoral College voted in a majority for Donald Trump. You should get 270 seats. Okay, those who get 270 seats, that person will become the president of the, 270 votes, sorry, will become the president of the United States of America. Okay. The first time this happened was in the year 2000 when it was Al Gore versus George W. Bush. And Al Gore also had the popular vote apparently on his side. So he refused to concede defeat. Okay. But the Electoral College voted for George W. Bush. So this was taken to the Supreme Court of America, where there are 9 judges, and they ruled that as per the Constitution of the America, there is no sanctity to the popular vote. The only vote that matters is that of the Electoral College. And if the Electoral College has voted for uh, George Bush, then he is the president. Okay, and now we see Donald Trump is still sitting and throwing tantrums, refusing to accept the fact that he has been defeated even in the Electoral College, because John Biden has got 312 votes from the Electoral College. Joe Biden, so right, not John Biden, sorry. So now what I would like you to understand is America is not a democracy. So don't use that Lincoln's idea of democracy. So what is a democracy? It is the self-rule of the people. That is how you have to understand democracy. And we have been fed on a diet of uh, studies starting in school when we had the subject social science, social studies. In the civics component, people talk about democracy, and people will tell you that democracy is the most desired form of governance, and that it was the ancient Greeks who had democracy. And then you are told that there are 2 forms of democracy. One which is direct democracy, which was followed in the city-states of ancient Greece. And the other one is what we have now as representative democracy, where people elect leaders to represent them in the legislature, which is a mini whichever country. If it is India, you'll say it's a mini India. Okay. Now, this is what we are told. Now, let's forget the second part of it. We'll come to that later. The first part of it, did the Greeks actually have direct democracy? The answer is no. Most of the Greek police, not city states, I told you, they do not conform to the idea that they are either a city or a state as we know them. They were a group of villages with the Acropolis in the center. I'm not repeating that. And you will see that only the citizens of Athens, who were a very small number, had some kind of rule wherein they got together and deliberated on matters. And please remember that not everybody is a citizen. Citizenship was given only to a few people using various criteria, and these few people debated among themselves. So, strictly speaking, even Athens had some kind of an aristocratic rule. Okay, it wasn't a democratic rule at all. And if you look at the other the other police in ancient Greece, you will find that in these police, you had some kind of monarchy. You know, there would be one head of government, one person who would be heading the government. Now, that is the case with Sparta. It had a ruler, one person. Uh, Athens is the only polis that had this citizens. All right. And even if you read Plato, Aristotle, those who talked about politics, these were the first people to actually talk about politics. And if you read both Plato and Aristotle, you will see that both of them have rated democracy as the worst form of government. Okay, the worst form of government is a democracy, right? That is what both Plato and Aristotle say. And in India, when we became independent, when Nehru was questioned, our first prime minister, Jawaharlal Nehru, who nowadays is being vilified left, right, and center. If there is a choked drain in your locality, people will tell you this is because of Jawaharlal Nehru. Okay, if a wall collapses somewhere, people will say it is because of Jawaharlal Nehru, which is a very sad state of affairs, because whatever development we are seeing today is because of the vision of Nehru. Nehru was a truly great man. And Nehru, when he was asked about democracy, his answer was, he said, from among all the systems of government that are available to the human being, uh, the worst system of government is democracy. Yet, I support it. So people said, if it is the worst form of government, why do you support it? He said, because if you give the right to vote through which people can remove representatives or put representatives, then that acts as a deterrent to the kind of governments that came into being in Germany, the Nazi Party, which was National Socialist Party, the Nazi Party, but it became a totalitarian regime that killed people, that picked on Jews and used them as laboratory animals. And then you have fascism, Fascism, pronounced fascism, in Italy, which was under Benito Mussolini. So you have Hitler, Mussolini, and even communism. Even communism in the USSR under Stalin had become dictatorial. Okay, Stalin had an opponent in the form of Trotsky. Trotsky didn't agree with Stalin. So Stalin decided that Trotsky must go, which means he must die. So Trotsky escaped to Argentina, and Stalin chased him down to Argentina and got him killed there. Okay, that was the way in which Stalin became a dictator. So Nehru said if these things shouldn't happen, doesn't matter if democracy is a terrible form of government. He said it's an extremely unenlightened form of government. But he said at least people will have their freedoms. That is why I support it. But Plato wasn't as charitable as Nehru. Neither was Aristotle. Okay. So for Plato, there is a system of a cycle. You see both Aristotle and Plato using this cycle. The cycle is that Plato sees that the best form of government is a monarchy. Okay, it becomes the best form of government, a monarchy. And then he says a monarch after some time will get corrupted by power. Okay, he will get corrupted by power, and when he gets corrupted by power, he will essentially launch a rule which is ruthless, and this form of this degeneration of the monarchy for him becomes tyranny. Okay, tyranny is where you rule like a tyrant without any respect for the rights of the people. And this is a degenerative cycle. And this goes, next step in this is what he calls a timocracy, Timocracy. A timocracy is a very bad kind of ruling system of people, which comprises of some number or a group, a fairly large group of people who decide that they will rule. They are unenlightened, they are uneducated, and he says a democracy therefore is worse than a tyranny. And after a democracy, he says when that further perverts and degenerates, it becomes a democracy. So what is a democracy? A democracy is nothing but mob rule. In Greek language, demos, demos is an unruly mob of people. Okay, so democracy is an unruly mob or rule of this particular kind of mob. So people also used to call it mobocracy. So Plato didn't support this. Now, I told you, please look at the influences that Plato has. Let's go back to the Periclean oration. And when he heard the Periclean oration, he wanted to create the ideal state that would have at its center the best possible form of governance and government. Okay, so he wrote the Republic with the intention of identifying that form of rule or governance or government which would contribute to the well-being of every single person in a polis. That is where he starts. And he believes that the ideal is the real. So the ideal that he's talking about is the one that will become, that is the real, and that will do good for society. It's not the opposite of real. Why? Plato says when we are born, we are not born with an empty mind. Okay, this is where his theory of forms comes into being. I told you the third influence on Plato is Pythagoras. Pythagoras, apart from being a mathematician, geometrician, you're familiar, I'm sure, with the uh, Pythagorean theorem. Okay, the square on the hypotenuse in a right angle triangle is equal to the sum of the squares on the other two sides. That is the Pythagorean theorem. And that uses a deductive method to arrive at proof. So this is the kind of methodology that Plato also uses. He uses his way of arriving at the ideal state is through logical, geometrical deduction. And here, the theory of forms plays an extremely important role because Pythagoras believed that people were reborn. Okay, unlike in India, where we have a theory of rebirth and we say everything has a soul, including stones, sand grains, everything is living in the universe and everything has a soul. But if you go to the Greeks believed that only the human beings had souls. Okay, and Pythagoras believed in life after death and rebirth. Okay, so this particular idea Plato borrows from Pythagoras, apart from the mathematical deductive method. Now, what is the theory of forms? The theory of forms is simple. The form that Plato is talking about is the soul. Okay, it is a soul, and when somebody dies, the soul leaves the body. And what happens to it? It goes to what he calls the realm of the souls. So this is a realm where souls are there without bodies, and there the souls, according to him, they do exchange knowledge from various different lives that they have lived. Okay, exchanging knowledge from various different lives that they have lived, the experiences and the knowledge that has come out of that. So that is a theory of forms. Because of these forms, the souls, when somebody is born, that person is born with knowledge in his head already. He is not born with an empty mind. He is born with knowledge. So he says all knowledge is innate, INNATE, innate or inborn, INBORN, which is knowledge comes by birth itself. It's not something that we acquire by reading books. It's not something that we acquire by going somewhere and experiencing something and then saying, oh, this is how I have knowledge. He says, because of the realm of forms and because the form again takes on a body, the mind is filled with the knowledge of that form or the soul. I'll stop here today because it says less than 1 minute, and we'll pick up this tomorrow and we'll move on with Plato. We'll try and finish off Plato as much as we can, as quickly as we can. Please give me the 1 o'clock